If you are watching this, the day has finally come. After months of struggle to find the time to really get to work on this video, my 1,000 subscriber special has finally come. This was originally an essay I wrote for a class that I took my second to last semester of college, and for a while I had been doing slight edits here and there to it so that I could potentially get it published as a pamphlet or in an academic journal. But, other than a couple videos that I've done about Japanese politics and history, I haven't seen a single person on BreadTube or TankyTube or whatever you want to call it talk about communism in Japan. So I figured that it would be appropriate to turn this paper that I've invested a lot of time in into a special video rather than just publish it as a document. I recorded this video over the course of 2 non-consecutive days, hence the wardrobe change sometime past the halfway point. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing and checking out some of my other videos, maybe share them around with your friends. If you have the means to and would like to support me this way, I would greatly appreciate contributions on Buy Me a Coffee. You can do a one-time donation for as little as $1, or you can join a $5 a month membership that includes perks such as having your name listed in every video that I upload as a thank you, and being sent a list of recommended reading from me every month. On that note, I present to you my 1,000 subscriber special, Workers' Movements, Communism in Japan, and the Japanese Communist Party. Enjoy.
It can rightfully be inferred that when one is asked to think of the political landscape of Japan, there are 3 different ideals and eras that come to mind. There are some that would recall Japanese feudalism and the era of the shogunate. Others may remember the imperial age of the early to mid-1900s and the descent into fascism. One may even head towards the contemporary history of the Liberal Democratic Party and the decades of dominance exhibited by the practically permanent ruling party. Although their governmental power has fluctuated throughout Japan's history, those within the communist and socialist fields have still had a great deal of influence in the political sphere of Japan. The emergence of leftist and worker-oriented movements in Japan was not out of thin air, and the presence of working-class-oriented, anti-capitalist philosophy in Japan is a history that often receives lesser attention in contemporary historical analysis. The lasting impact that leftism has had on Japan is not one to be ignored, as this impact still affects Japanese political discourse to this day, focusing on movements of the Late-Meiji period, the development of the JCP, or Japanese Communist Party, along with touching upon other significant events and developments of Japanese leftism. The advancement of socialist and working-class-oriented philosophy serves a great importance to Japan's political landscape. This importance stems from the entrenchment of socialism into the discourse of Japanese politics and its everlasting influence. One of the most significant turning points throughout all of Japanese history is the establishing of the Meiji Restoration, an event that ushered in the reinstatement of direct imperial rule after the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the Bakufu. Of the many accomplishments and political developments that came with the rise of the Meiji, it was in the later period of the Meiji era that saw the emergence of a considerable labor movement at the turn of the 20th century. Worker movements of the late Meiji period were characterized by splits in perception, occupation, and reasons for engaging in pro-worker demonstrations. As detailed in an article for the French publication, and pardon me if I butcher the French, I didn't study it in school, the Bulletin de l'École Française d'Extrême Orient, or Bulletin of the French School of the Far East, the experiences and tactics of artisans and modern industry workers such as textile workers and those in heavy industry, they shaped different paths for the 2 movements. The artisans ultimately found themselves in a position of relative privilege in comparison to the textile workers and others within modern industry. As disputes regarding wages and regulations were the primary focus of the artisan struggle, such struggles culminated in the establishing of organized forces in both Yokohama and Tokyo in the late 1890s. shipwrights in the two regions had successfully organized and orchestrated strikes demanding a pay raise to counter the inflation that came as a result of the Sino-Japanese War. The forces of the two unions were of considerable nature, with the Tokyo Union boasting 640 members by mid-1897 and the Yokohama Shipwrights Union, founded that same year, boasting 360 members. These unions had successfully been able to win their demands for a pay increase with organizational precision, exemplifying the predominance of the issue of wages in the artisan struggle of the late era of the Meiji. Textile workers and others in modern industry, however, aim to combat the abhorrent conditions in their respective work environments. Whereas artisans led demonstrations from a relatively socially privileged status, modern industry workers were subjected to a plethora of abuses and other exploitative practices in the later stages of the Meiji Restoration. Although the effects of extensively exploitative practices ultimately prevented demonstrations from happening at a frequent level, textile workers indeed vented their grievances and organized a number of times in the late stage Meiji. These demonstrations, however, often lacked sufficient planning and exhibited a gender-related chauvinistic attitude in application. Men were a minority in textile factories, however they tended to be the ones leading demonstrations. Also, numerous sections of the workforce tended not to engage in these actions, and women employed in these mills were often subjected to job insecurity and oppressive application of the dormitory system that women workers adhered to. Prior to the implementing of these dormitories, however, women engaged in pro-worker demonstrations at a relatively more frequent rate. In 1912, the year that the Meiji Restoration officially came to an end, discriminatory practices had unfortunately remained commonplace in textile mills, and the conditions of textile workers remained low in quality. To quote Andrew Gordon, "Textile workers in Tokyo accounted for 43% of the city's factory workforce. Of these, 76% were women, and half of all textile workers were under age 20. Gordon would say further, "While male machine industry workers generally worked 10 to 11 hours per day, female mill workers commonly labored for 12 to 14-hour days. Typical wages for textile women stood at 20 to 30 sen per day, lower than the male textile workers, whose pay ranged from 30 to 55 sen, and well below the 45 to 75 sen per day range for machinists. In addition, the mill workers contracted tuberculosis at a rate that soon made Japan a world leader in this disease." The Japanese Communist Party had been officially established in 1922, 10 years after the fall of the Meiji Empire, considering itself a party of scientific socialism, holding it as its theoretical basis following the Japanese history of the struggle for social progress and change. The JCP established its founding mission as follows: to be the abolition of the absolute emperor system of government, the semi-feudal conditions, denial of rights and liberties usually considered universal, and monopoly capitalism. Such goals and ideological stances are in line with the basis of socialist and communist theory. However, the progress towards achieving these goals was rather stagnant for some time, especially considering the fact that the Japanese Communist Party was outlawed by the ruling imperial government from its very inception, in addition to facing military and governmental hostility. The JCP was forced into underground practices until after World War II, following the defeat of Japanese fascism in 1945. Occupied Japan and post-occupation Japan witnessed a myriad of changes in line with the transition from autocratic fascism to a generally democratic foundation, at least compared to that of Imperial Japan. Upon implementation of General Douglas MacArthur's initiatives as SCAP, or Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, to democratize Japan, the Communist Party had officially gained a legal standing in line with the newly guaranteed freedoms of free speech, dissenting political activity, and the release of political prisoners taken in by the imperial fascists, allowing the JCP to move beyond the underground realm and into a greater connection with the mainstream political experience. Freeing political prisoners meant that highly recognized party members Tokura Kyuchi and Shiga Yoshio could re-engage with the JCP. These two would go on to publish the first post-war edition of Akahata, in which the two party figures would simultaneously show support for the initiative pushed by the Allies, and they're setting the foundation for Japan's democratic revolution. The Communist Party in post-war Japan experienced various gains in terms of membership, along with challenges on the global socialist scale. In 1950, the party exhibited a surge in popularity, with the number of members more than doubling between 1947 and 1950, from 70,000 to 160,000 registered members. This same year saw a major split in Japanese communism, and the global socialist movement as a whole in one sense or another, with the JCP under one Sanzo Nosaka adopting a pacifistic approach to establishing communism, contrasting the revolutionary theory upheld by the Soviet Union and, at an earlier point, the JCP itself. Although electoral and theoretical developments occurred throughout the 1970s, it was in the 1980s that Japanese socialism and the JCP endured some of its greatest ideological battles: the Gorbachev era and the fall of the Soviet Union. Despite the lack of cooperation with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in earlier years, the JCP initially expressed displeasure with the measures taken during the era of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the CPSU and the so-called reform of Soviet socialism. However, in line with the ultimately revisionist tendency of the JCP at this time, support for such measures as perestroika and glasnost became a staple in the development of the party in the 1980s. The dissolution of the Soviet Union had a monumental effect on the global communist movement, with the superpower's death instituting the founding of the capitalist Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin, weakening both the surviving socialist states, China, Cuba, etc., and the various other socialist and communist parties around the world, pro-Soviet or not. Although the JCP in general had not been a pro-Soviet communist party, they had still initially faced the brunt of the global communist movement's detriment. Despite the fall of the USSR, the JCP, at least on a local level, maintained a relatively strong basis in Japanese politics in the mid-90s. On a local level, the gains of the JCP experienced a grand increase not seen at that time since 1989. At this time, the JCP held 3,959 seats in town halls and other local institutions, just short of 4,000, in addition to a number of members reaching mayoral status in various towns. Along with the numerical increase of Communist Party members in local government, the extension of legislative abilities gave further strength to the communists. In Japan, all parties are required to have at least 1/8 of seats in local assemblies to be able to propose legislation. And thanks to the many local successes of the party in the mid-90s, the JCP had regained the power to do so. Approximately a year and a half later, the JCP experienced a similar rise in legislative presence in the 1996 general elections. The election for the House of Representatives yielded 7 million votes for the Japanese Communist Party, equaling 12% of the entirety of votes. The amount of seats held by the JCP nearly doubled in this 1996 election, garnering an increase of 11 seats, adding onto the previously established 15, totaling to 26 seats in Japan's House of Representatives. Similarly to the advancements of the local government, the JCP regained the ability to introduce legislation on the federal level, so long that it does not concern questions of budgeting and stuff like that. Communism, while its influence is not strong enough to take significant control of the government at this point, has been alive and well in Japan throughout the last couple decades. As early as 2007, the 21st century gains of the Communist Party had started to become more and more apparent. The JCP in 2007 boasted party membership at 400,000 members, and additionally had garnered over 7% of the popular vote in the 2005 general elections, reaching approximate numbers of 4 million votes. Although the Japanese Communist Party has not held a significant number of parliamentary seats or established itself as the ruling class, the party, at least in 2007, was described as, and I quote, probably the most successful non-ruling communist party in Asia, if not the world. Both prior to and in the midst of the global economic crisis of the late 2000s, the JCP and public interest in communism in general in Japan saw a substantial rise as an alternative to the capitalist system. This rise in interest initially came as a result of a resurgence in popularity of the novel Kanikosen, translated as The Crab Factory Ship, written in the late 1920s from the Marxist viewpoint by Takiji Kobayashi. The reemergence of this novel and the electoral gains of the JCP throughout 2005 brought about a revitalized popularity of the Japanese Communist Party, with the party seeing 1,000 newly registered members each month throughout 2008. It was in 2013 that the JCP engaged in a new method of party recruitment and the popularization of socialism. Adorable mascots! A means of simplifying and making politics more digestible, the ensemble of animated communists led by the character Kaku-san, the leader of the JCP's cartoon mascots, sought to attract potential voters and engage in the digital realm of discourse and campaigning.
もっと政治を分かりやすく、
もっと政治を親しみやすく、
正しい政策を、
楽しい政治を
たくさん。
日本共産党拡散部始めました。共産党拡散部で検索せよ。
According to information from Forbes, the communists in Japan have still had the power to influence both governmental proceedings and the general public itself. The results of the 2017 Tokyo Assembly election are proof of the strengthening of the JCP in the modern age. Although soon after the communists would lose a number of seats in the lower half of parliament, the Japan Communist Party have been able to secure nearly 20 seats in the assembly, with the exact number of 19 being only slightly lower than the results for the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. In addition to parliamentary victories, the popularity of Akahata has seen a mild resurgence in the late 2010s, boasting over 1.12 million readers in 2017, causing some to predict that in due time, the JCP's leftist literature will reach a point of popularity higher than the currently cycling Sankei Shimbun, a leading far-right newspaper. As displayed on the official website for the Japanese Communist Party, the circulation of Akahata is narrowly higher than the number presented by Forbes, citing a 0.01 increase to 1.13 million readers. In terms of party membership and political proceedings of the JCP, as of 2017, the party holds membership with 300,000 people among 20,000 party branches. Furthermore, in regards to JCP presence in the Diet, there are 12 seats held by communists in the House of Representatives, and the House of Councilors having 14 sitting members of the Communist Party. Although the JCP claims to uphold scientific socialism, their theoretical application has lost much of its luster throughout the course of history, with the party ultimately rejecting the prospect of a full-on revolution in the modern age, and focusing exclusively on the Diet and parliamentary means of political shift. Their theoretical understanding of contemporary conditions has waned as well, with the JCP releasing a statement in support of the protests in Hong Kong, despite these protests having support from both the USA's National Endowment for Democracy, or the CIA, and Ukrainian fascists. Although the Japanese Communist Party has established itself as the most powerful communist party in the country, a myriad of other branches of the socialist ideology have at least had a modicum of a presence in Japan's political discourse and leftist circles. Marxism has served as the primary basis of most leftist movements on the island. However, a number of variants of Marxist thought have held prominence throughout Japanese communist history. Marxists in Japan, however, did not belong exclusively to the JCP, the Japanese Socialist Party, for instance, serving as an alternative hub for those of the Marxist tendency, along with the inclusion of Christian Marxist, Buddhist Marxist, and other theologically based forms of Marxism having their place in the spectrum of Japanese leftism. Marxism had cemented a foothold in Japan's academia, and although it's not permitted for state-employed educators in Japan to have any direct connection to any political parties, a Marxist presence was ultimately established, accompanying in the advancement of educational means and underground communists in state schools. The various splits within the communist movement in Japan during the mid-20th century in particular were caused by political and theoretical disagreement on significant aspects of global communism, particularly issues regarding the Soviet Union or methods of solidifying political power. Trotskyism in Japan has not historically been an alien concept. In 1957, the Japan Trotskyist League, also known as the Nihon Toroshikitsuto Renmei, was established as an alternative to the JCP, who, according to the Trotskyist League, had abandoned the theory of revolutionary socialism earlier in that decade. Despite the JTL undergoing its own number of name changes and ideological splits, Trotskyism remained in political discourse in Japan, at least on the leftist side. Japanese Trotskyism officially incorporated the institution of the Fourth International in 1965, and it was this incarnation of Trotskyist theory that had the most effect on Japan's social and political institutions. Considered the only true major Trotskyist organization in Japan at the time, the Dayan Internationalu Nihon Shibu arguably got the most done compared to other Trotskyist organizations, considering how it seemed to have taken the longest to come to an ideological split, and the Japanese Fourth International's involvement with struggles on college campuses, and the rejection of the construction of the Narita National Airport. The history of Trotskyism in Japan, however, is not made up entirely of success stories and ideological splits. Trots in Japan have often engaged in espionage and sabotage against such juggernauts of socialism as the Soviet Union and the communists in China. Though they were based in China, a number of Trotskyists acted as spies against the Communist Party of China and served as assets of Imperial Japan in the late 1930s, as laid out in 1939 by who would become the revered leader of Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito. To quote, "In China, the Trotskyists perform espionage service at the Japanese headquarters. There, those bandits change their clothes with the uniforms of the 8th Popular Army, kill and rob the peasants and the commanders of the 8th Army, deliver military plans to the Japanese conquerors, and are trying by all means to make difficult the liberation struggle of the Chinese people." End quote. Communism and working class movements in Japan possess a long and illustrious history. Through various twists and turns, political evolution and adaptations, and ultimately misguidance and pacification of tactics, leftism in Japan, at least for some of its most historically significant figures and organizations, has endured simultaneously a political strengthening and an ideological weakening. Though the electoral gains of the Communist Party are nothing to ignore, and are indeed beneficial for the party's political influence, the revisionist tendency within the party, and the unfortunate insignificance overall of late-Meiji workers' movements, ultimately tarnishes, to a degree, both the legacy and the theoretical solidity of Japan's communist and socialist tendencies.
I'd like to thank everybody that has subscribed. Everybody that voted in the poll I put up when I first hit 1,000 subscribers. I'd like to thank everybody that actively watches my videos, that actually interacts with my videos by commenting or liking them. I'd like to thank everybody that's helped me find sources for other videos, and everybody that's critiqued my videos in good faith so that I could learn to make better content and conduct better research. I'd like to thank Lefty Vlogs for the shout out that he gave my channel a few months ago. I'd like to thank all of the left book groups that allow me to share my content. In advance, I would like to thank everybody who contributes on Buy Me a Coffee. And I would like to thank everybody that has encouraged me to make these videos over the past few years. My name is Jymee. Thank you for watching.